In the ancient city of Susa, where marble columns reached toward heaven and golden tapestries adorned the palace walls, a story unfolded that would echo through the ages. It was a tale of pride and prejudice, of hidden identities and divine providence, of one man's burning hatred that would nearly destroy an entire people. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most dramatic episodes in biblical history, where political intrigue meets divine intervention in ways that will leave you absolutely stunned. Have you ever wondered how a single moment of disrespect could spiral into genocide? How one man's wounded ego could threaten the survival of God's chosen people? What we're about to discover is a masterpiece of storytelling that reveals the dangerous consequences of unchecked pride and the mysterious ways God works behind the scenes to protect his people. I'm going to walk you through the explosive confrontation between Haman and Mordecai, two men whose clash would shake the very foundations of the Persian Empire. But this isn't just an ancient story. This is a timeless lesson about the battle between good and evil, between humility and arrogance, between those who serve God and those who serve themselves. Now, before we dive into this incredible narrative, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might think. The events we're about to explore didn't just happen in some distant past. They reveal patterns of human behavior that we see repeated throughout history. The psychology of Haman, the courage of Mordecai, and the hidden hand of providence working through seemingly ordinary circumstances, these elements continue to shape our world today. What makes this story absolutely riveting is how it begins with something so simple, yet sets in motion events that would determine the fate of millions. We're talking about a moment when one man refused to bow, and another man's pride was so wounded that he plotted the complete annihilation of an entire race. But here's what's truly remarkable. Even though God's name is never mentioned in the book of Esther, his fingerprints are all over this story. Let me paint the scene for you. The Persian Empire stretched from India to Ethiopia, encompassing 127 provinces. King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, ruled from his magnificent palace in Susa. This was a world of absolute power, where the king's word was law and disobedience meant death. Into this world stepped two men whose destinies would become forever intertwined, Haman the Agagite and Mordecai the Jew. Haman had risen to unprecedented heights in the Persian court. The king had promoted him above all the other nobles, making him second only to the king himself. Every day, as Haman walked through the king's gate, all the royal officials would bow down and pay homage to him, just as the king had commanded. The sight of these powerful men prostrating themselves before him must have filled Haman with tremendous satisfaction. After all, he had climbed the ladder of political success, and now he stood at its very peak. But there was one man who refused to bow. Day after day, as Haman passed through the king's gate, Mordecai the Jew remained standing. While everyone else fell to their knees in submission, Mordecai stood firm, his eyes looking straight ahead, his back unbent. This wasn't mere stubbornness or disrespect for authority. Mordecai was making a statement that would echo through eternity. There is only one worthy of ultimate worship, and that is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The other officials noticed Mordecai's defiance immediately. They spoke to him day after day, urging him to comply with the king's command. "Why do you disobey the king's order?" they asked. But Mordecai remained unmoved. He had told them he was a Jew, and this explanation carried weight because everyone understood that Jews had certain religious convictions that prevented them from bowing to any man as if he were a god. For a while, This standoff continued. The officials kept pressuring Mordecai, and Mordecai kept refusing to bow. Finally, their patience wore thin, and they decided to report the matter to Haman himself. They wanted to see whether Mordecai's defiance would be tolerated or whether consequences would follow. Little did they know that this simple act of reporting would light a fuse that would threaten to explode across the entire empire. When Haman learned that Mordecai refused to bow down to him, something dark awakened in his heart. This wasn't just about protocol or respect for authority. This was personal. Here was Haman, at the pinnacle of his career, enjoying the submission of the most powerful men in the empire, and yet one man, one insignificant Jewish exile, dared to remain standing in his presence. The humiliation was unbearable. But Haman's reaction reveals something deeply troubling about his character. Rather than simply having Mordecai punished or removed from his position, Haman's wounded pride demanded something far more sinister. The text tells us that when Haman learned Mordecai was a Jew, he thought it beneath him to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he began plotting to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire kingdom of Ahasuerus. Think about the staggering scope of this plan. Because one man refused to bow, Haman decided that an entire people group must be eliminated. This wasn't justice. This was genocide, motivated by nothing more than wounded pride. Haman's hatred had metastasized from personal offense to racial animosity, from individual revenge to systematic extermination. The psychology behind Haman's reaction is both fascinating and terrifying. Here was a man who had everything: power, prestige, wealth, and influence. Yet the refusal of one man to acknowledge his greatness was enough to drive him to contemplate mass murder. This reveals a fundamental truth about pride. It can never be satisfied. No matter how many people bow, if even one person refuses to submit, pride feels threatened and demands increasingly extreme measures to protect itself. Haman began to craft his plan carefully. He knew he couldn't simply approach the king and ask permission to kill all the Jews because of a personal grudge. He needed a strategy that would make his proposal seem reasonable, even necessary for the good of the empire. So he began to study the Jewish people, looking for characteristics he could twist into accusations, customs he could portray as threats to the kingdom's stability. What Haman discovered was that the Jews were indeed different from the other peoples in the empire. They had their own laws, their own customs, their own religious practices. They gathered together for worship. They observed different holy days. They followed dietary restrictions that set them apart from their neighbors. In Haman's twisted mind, these differences became evidence of disloyalty, proof that the Jews were a threat to the unity and security of the Persian Empire. The stage was now set for one of history's most audacious acts of manipulation. Haman would approach King Ahasuerus with a carefully crafted proposal, one designed to appeal to the king's concerns about governing such a vast and diverse empire. But beneath the veneer of political wisdom lay the heart of a man consumed by hatred, a man whose wounded pride would stop at nothing to achieve its revenge. What makes this story so compelling is how it reveals the true nature of evil. Haman wasn't some obviously wicked villain twirling his mustache in a dark corner. He was a successful politician, a man who had risen through the ranks of government, someone who understood how to navigate the complexities of court life. Yet beneath this respectable exterior lurked a heart capable of unimaginable cruelty. The contrast between Haman and Mordecai couldn't be more striking. Haman sought glory for himself and demanded that others acknowledge his greatness. Mordecai, on the other hand, reserved his ultimate allegiance for God alone, understanding that human authority, no matter how impressive, is temporary and limited. Haman's power was built on the submission of others, while Mordecai's strength came from his unwavering faith in the Almighty. As we watch these events unfold, we begin to see the hand of providence working in ways that the characters themselves cannot yet perceive. Mordecai's refusal to bow wasn't just an act of religious conviction. It was a catalyst that would expose the true nature of evil in the Persian court. Haman's plot against the Jews would ultimately reveal the lengths to which pride will go to protect itself, and it would set in motion a series of events that would demonstrate God's protection of his people in the most unexpected ways. The tension in the story continues to build as we realize that Mordecai has no idea what storm his simple act of defiance has unleashed. He continues his daily routine, passing through the king's gate, conducting his business, unaware that the most powerful man in the empire after the king himself is plotting not just his death, but the death of every Jewish person in the known world. Meanwhile, in the royal palace, Haman was perfecting his strategy with the calculating precision of a master manipulator. He understood that timing was everything in the world of Persian politics. He couldn't simply storm into the throne room demanding the extermination of an entire people. No, this required finesse, careful planning, and most importantly, the right moment when the king would be most receptive to his proposal. Haman began by observing the king's moods and routines. He studied when Ahasuerus was most agreeable, when he was distracted by other concerns, and when he might be most susceptible to suggestions about threats to his empire. This wasn't the work of an impulsive man acting on emotion. This was the methodical planning of someone who understood exactly how to exploit the fears and insecurities of absolute power. The brilliance of Haman's approaching strategy lay in how he would frame the issue. He wouldn't present this as a personal vendetta against one defiant Jew. Instead, he would paint a picture of a vast internal threat, a scattered people whose strange customs and foreign loyalties posed a danger to the very fabric of Persian civilization. He would make the king believe that decisive action wasn't just warranted, it was absolutely necessary for the survival of the empire. But as Haman plotted in the shadows, he remained completely unaware of a crucial piece of information that would ultimately prove to be his undoing. Hidden in plain sight, walking the halls of the very palace where Haman schemed, was someone whose true identity would shatter all his carefully laid plans. Queen Esther, the beautiful woman who had captured the king's heart and earned his favor, was herself a Jew. The irony of the situation is almost breathtaking. Here was Haman, plotting the destruction of the Jewish people, while serving in a court where the queen herself belonged to the very group he sought to eliminate. But Esther had kept her heritage secret, following the wise counsel of her guardian Mordecai, who had instructed her never to reveal her people or her family background. This hidden identity wasn't just a plot device, it was a demonstration of how God often works through circumstances that seem coincidental but are actually part of a much larger design. The same providence that had elevated Esther to the position of queen had also placed her in the perfect position to become the salvation of her people, though she didn't yet know it. As days passed, Haman's resentment toward Mordecai continued to fester and grow. Every morning, as he made his way through the king's gate, the sight of Mordecai standing upright while others bowed filled him with fresh rage. The wound to his pride never healed, because it was reopened daily by Mordecai's quiet but unmistakable defiance. What made Mordecai's refusal even more galling to Haman was its consistency. This wasn't a momentary act of rebellion or a single instance of disrespect. Day after day, week after week, Mordecai maintained his position. There was something almost serene about his defiance, as if he drew strength from a source that Haman couldn't understand or touch. Other court officials began to take notice of this ongoing confrontation. Some whispered among themselves about Mordecai's stubbornness, wondering why he would risk the wrath of such a powerful man over what seemed like a simple gesture of respect. Others began to sense the growing tension and wondered what consequences might follow. The atmosphere in the royal court grew thick with anticipation, as if everyone could feel that something significant was building toward an inevitable climax. Haman finally decided that the time had come to act. He had studied the king's patterns, perfected his arguments, and prepared his proposal. But even as he made his final preparations, he added one more element to his plan that revealed the depth of his vindictive nature. He decided to cast lots, called pur in the Persian language, to determine the most auspicious day for carrying out his planned genocide. The casting of lots was a common practice in the ancient world, used to make important decisions by seeking divine guidance or favorable timing. But in Haman's case, this wasn't a genuine seeking of wisdom. It was a superstitious ritual designed to give his evil plan the appearance of divine sanction. He wanted to believe that the gods themselves approved of his intended massacre. The lots were cast in the first month, the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus. Day by day, month by month, the lots were cast until they fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. This gave Haman nearly a full year to implement his plan, time to work out every detail, to ensure that his scheme would be carried out with maximum efficiency across the entire empire. But what Haman didn't realize was that this delay, which he saw as an opportunity for thorough preparation, was actually providing time for forces beyond his control to align against him. The same providence that had placed Esther on the throne was now orchestrating timing that would work in favor of the very people Haman sought to destroy. During this period of preparation, Haman's hatred continued to consume him. He couldn't enjoy his meals, his sleep was troubled by dreams of revenge, and even his family began to notice the change in his demeanor. His wife Zeresh and his friends tried to console him, but nothing could satisfy the burning resentment that had taken root in his heart. The tragedy of Haman's situation was that he had everything a man could want in terms of worldly success, yet he was miserable because of one man's refusal to acknowledge his greatness. This reveals a profound truth about the nature of pride. It makes happiness dependent on the submission of others. A proud person can never truly rest because there might always be someone, somewhere, who doesn't recognize their superiority. Mordecai, meanwhile, continued his daily routine, completely unaware of the storm that was gathering around him. He went about his duties, cared for his community, and maintained his quiet dignity in the face of growing hostility. His refusal to bow wasn't motivated by personal animosity toward Haman. It was simply a matter of principle, a line he would not cross regardless of the consequences. The contrast between these two men becomes even more striking when we consider their responses to conflict. Haman, faced with opposition, sought to destroy not just his opponent, but everyone associated with him. Mordecai, faced with pressure to compromise his convictions, simply stood firm without seeking to harm anyone else. One man's response revealed a heart full of hatred and violence, while the other's response revealed a heart committed to truth and righteousness. As Haman prepared to approach the king with his deadly proposal, The tension in the story reached a crescendo. Everything now hinged on a single conversation between the most powerful man in the empire and his most trusted advisor. The fate of an entire people would be decided by words spoken in the royal throne room, by arguments crafted in the darkness of one man's wounded pride. But even as Haman prepared his most persuasive rhetoric, forces were already in motion that would ultimately expose the true nature of his character and the bankruptcy of his cause. The very foundations of his plan contained the seeds of its own destruction, though he was too blinded by hatred to see them. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal not just the depths of human evil, but also the mysterious ways in which justice and mercy work together to protect the innocent and expose the guilty. What appeared to be a simple clash between two men in a royal court was actually a cosmic battle between the forces of light and darkness, between those who serve the true God and those who worship only themselves. The moment had finally arrived. Haman strode through the corridors of the royal palace with the confidence of a man who believed destiny was on his side. His elaborate robes rustled against the marble floors, and the sound of his footsteps echoed through the vast hallways like a drumbeat announcing his approach. Today, he would present his case to King Ahasuerus, and by evening, he was certain that his plan for the complete destruction of the Jewish people would have royal approval. But what Haman didn't understand was that he was walking into a trap of his own making. His pride had blinded him to the intricate web of relationships and hidden connections that surrounded him in the Persian court. He saw only what he wanted to see, heard only what confirmed his prejudices, and believed only what served his purposes. This tunnel vision, born of arrogance and hatred, was about to become his greatest weakness. King Ahasuerus was holding court that day, receiving reports from his various administrators and making decisions that would affect millions of people across his vast empire. The king was known for his quick decisions and his trust in his closest advisors, particularly Haman, whom he had elevated above all other nobles. When Haman requested a private audience, the king immediately granted it, curious to hear what important matter his most trusted counselor wished to discuss. Haman had rehearsed his presentation countless times, perfecting every word, every gesture, every inflection. He understood that he had only one chance to convince the king, and everything depended on how skillfully he could manipulate the conversation. As he entered the royal presence, Haman's heart raced with anticipation, but his outward demeanor remained calm and respectful. The king welcomed Haman warmly, as he always did. There was genuine affection in their relationship, or at least what Ahasuerus believed to be genuine affection. The king had come to rely heavily on Haman's counsel, trusting his judgment in matters both great and small. This trust, built over years of careful cultivation, was exactly what Haman was counting on to make his monstrous proposal palatable. Haman began his presentation with the skill of a master orator. He didn't immediately mention the Jews or reveal his true intentions. Instead, he painted a picture of the challenges facing any ruler of a diverse empire. He spoke eloquently about the difficulties of governing people with different customs, different laws, and different loyalties. He made these challenges seem not just inconvenient, but genuinely threatening to the stability of the kingdom. The king listened intently, nodding occasionally as Haman described the complexities of imperial administration. Ahasuerus had indeed struggled with these very issues throughout his reign. Managing an empire that stretched across 3 continents, encompassing dozens of different ethnic groups and hundreds of distinct communities, was an enormous challenge. Any suggestion that promised to simplify this task would naturally appeal to him. Then, with calculated precision, Haman made his move. He told the king about a particular group of people scattered throughout the empire who, he claimed, posed a unique threat to royal authority. These people, he explained, had their own laws that they followed instead of the king's laws. They formed a separate community within the larger population, maintaining their own customs and refusing to fully integrate into Persian society. Haman's words were carefully chosen to create maximum anxiety in the king's mind. He spoke of disloyalty without using the word directly. He implied sedition without making specific accusations. He suggested danger without providing concrete evidence. This was manipulation at its most sophisticated level, playing on the fears and insecurities that every absolute ruler carries deep in his heart. The king's expression grew more serious as Haman continued his presentation. The idea of a group of people within his empire who followed their own laws rather than his was indeed troubling. In an absolute monarchy, the king's word was supposed to be the final authority on all matters. Any suggestion that some of his subjects gave their ultimate allegiance to something or someone else would naturally be seen as a threat to royal power. But Haman wasn't finished. He had saved his most persuasive argument for last. With a show of reluctance, as if he were sharing information that pained him to reveal, Haman informed the king that tolerating this group was actually costing the royal treasury. He suggested that their different practices and customs were somehow detrimental to the economic well-being of the empire. Then came the masterstroke of Haman's presentation. He offered to pay 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury to cover the costs of dealing with this problem. This was an enormous sum, equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars in today's currency. The offer served multiple purposes in Haman's scheme. It demonstrated his supposed loyalty to the king. It made his proposal seem financially beneficial rather than costly, and it suggested that the threat was so serious that extraordinary measures were justified. The king was impressed by both the magnitude of the offer and the apparent selflessness of his advisor. Here was Haman, willing to spend his own fortune for the good of the empire. The financial implications alone made the proposal attractive, but it was the suggestion of disloyalty among his subjects that really captured the king's attention. Without asking for specifics about which group Haman was referring to, without inquiring about evidence to support these serious accusations, without consulting other advisors or conducting any investigation, King Ahasuerus made one of the most catastrophic decisions in recorded history. He removed his signet ring from his finger and handed it to Haman, giving him complete authority to handle the situation as he saw fit. The signet ring was more than just jewelry, it was the symbol of royal power. Documents sealed with this ring carried the full authority of the king himself and could not be revoked. By giving the ring to Haman, Ahasuerus was essentially signing a blank check, authorizing whatever action Haman deemed necessary without knowing what that action would be. The king's casual response revealed the dangerous combination of absolute power and administrative laziness. He told Haman to keep his money and to do with the people whatever seemed good to him. This wasn't the careful deliberation of a wise ruler weighing the lives of his subjects. This was the careless delegation of life and death authority to a subordinate, based on nothing more than trust and convenience. Haman could hardly contain his excitement as he left the royal presence. Everything had gone exactly as he had planned. Not only had he received permission to proceed with his genocidal scheme, but he had been given the resources of the entire imperial government to carry it out. The king's signet ring in his possession meant that he could issue decrees that would be obeyed throughout the empire without question. But in his moment of triumph, Haman made a crucial error. He had been so focused on achieving his goal that he had failed to consider all the potential consequences of his actions. His hatred for Mordecai and his contempt for the Jewish people had blinded him to the complex web of relationships and identities that existed within the royal court itself. The decree that Haman now prepared would be one of the most comprehensive and detailed documents of genocide in ancient history. He summoned the royal secretaries and began dictating the terms of what he believed would be the final solution to what he saw as the Jewish problem. The document would be translated into every language spoken throughout the empire and delivered to every province, ensuring that the king's supposed will would be carried out uniformly everywhere. The decree specified that on the 13th day of the 12th month, all Jews throughout the Persian Empire, young and old, women and children, were to be killed, destroyed, and annihilated in a single day. Furthermore, anyone who participated in this massacre would be permitted to plunder the property of their victims, providing a financial incentive for widespread participation in the slaughter. The systematic nature of this plan reveals the depth of Haman's evil. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of temporary insanity. This was a carefully calculated program of extermination designed to eliminate an entire people from the face of the earth. The inclusion of women and children in the decree shows that Haman's hatred extended beyond any political or religious considerations to encompass pure racial animosity. As copies of the decree were prepared and sealed with the king's ring, Haman felt a satisfaction unlike any he had ever experienced. Soon, every Jew in the empire would know that their days were numbered. Soon, Mordecai would understand the consequences of his defiance. Soon, the humiliation that Haman had endured would be avenged 1,000-fold. The speed with which the decree was distributed throughout the empire was remarkable. The Persian postal system was one of the most efficient in the ancient world, and within days, the terrible news had reached every corner of the kingdom. Local governors received their instructions, officials prepared their plans, and ordinary citizens began to contemplate the extraordinary event that would take place in less than a year. But as the decree spread throughout the empire, it began to have effects that Haman had never anticipated. The Jewish communities, faced with the prospect of total annihilation, didn't simply resign themselves to their fate. Instead, they began to fast, to pray, and to seek divine intervention. They understood that their situation was beyond human solution, that only God could save them from the destruction that had been decreed. Mordecai, when he learned of the decree, was devastated. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went into the midst of the city, crying out with a loud and bitter cry. His grief wasn't just for himself, but for his entire people. He understood immediately that his refusal to bow to Haman had somehow triggered this catastrophe, though he couldn't have imagined the extent of Haman's vindictive response. The sight of Mordecai in mourning, wailing in the streets of Susa, created a stir throughout the city. People began to understand that something terrible was happening, something that went far beyond ordinary political maneuvering. The decree that had seemed like just another administrative document to many officials was revealed to be a death sentence for their Jewish neighbors, colleagues, and friends. Word of Mordecai's distress eventually reached Queen Esther in the royal palace. Her servants and attendants reported that her guardian was in the streets, dressed in sackcloth, crying out in anguish. Esther was deeply troubled by this news and immediately sent clean clothes for Mordecai to wear. but he refused to accept them. This refusal was Mordecai's way of signaling that this was not a personal crisis that could be solved with kind gestures, but something far more serious. Esther then sent one of her trusted servants, a man named Hathach, to find out exactly what was troubling Mordecai. This decision would prove to be one of the most important moments in the entire story, though Esther couldn't have known it at the time. She was simply trying to help someone she cared about, but her actions were about to set in motion the very events that would expose Haman's plot and save her people. When Hathach found Mordecai in the city square, still dressed in sackcloth and mourning, Mordecai told him everything. He explained about the decree that had been issued for the destruction of all Jews throughout the empire. He even gave Hathach a copy of the written decree to show to Esther, so that she could see for herself the reality of the threat they faced. But Mordecai didn't stop with just informing Esther about the danger. He also gave Hathach a specific message for the queen, a message that would change the course of history. He instructed Hathach to tell Esther that she must go to the king and plead for the lives of her people. For the first time, Mordecai was asking Esther to reveal her Jewish identity and to use her position as queen to intervene in this crisis. When Hathach delivered this message to Esther, along with the copy of Haman's decree, the queen was faced with the most difficult decision of her life. She understood immediately the enormity of what Mordecai was asking her to do. Revealing her Jewish heritage would put her own life at risk, but remaining silent would mean watching her entire people be destroyed. Esther's initial response revealed both her wisdom and her fear. She sent word back to Mordecai, explaining that approaching the king without being summoned was punishable by death, unless the king extended his golden scepter to show mercy. She also pointed out that she hadn't been called to appear before the king for 30 days, suggesting that she may have fallen out of his favor. This exchange between Mordecai and Esther, conducted through the faithful messenger Hathach, represents one of the most crucial conversations in biblical history. On one side was Mordecai, convinced that Esther had been placed in her position for exactly this moment of crisis. On the other side was Esther, terrified of the risks involved in revealing her identity and confronting the king. Mordecai's response to Esther's concerns was both loving and challenging. He reminded her that she would not escape the fate of her people simply because she lived in the royal palace. If the decree was carried out, her Jewish heritage would eventually be discovered, and she would share the fate of all the other Jews in the empire. Her position as queen provided only temporary protection, not permanent safety. But then Mordecai said something that has echoed through the centuries, words that capture the essence of divine providence and human responsibility. He suggested that perhaps Esther had come to her royal position for such a time as this, for this very moment when her people needed someone with access to the king who could plead their cause. These words struck Esther's heart with the force of revelation. She began to understand that her rise to the throne hadn't been mere coincidence or personal good fortune. Instead, it had been part of a larger plan, a divine orchestration of events that had positioned her to serve as the salvation of her people at their moment of greatest need. The weight of this realization was both terrifying and inspiring. Esther understood that she was being called to risk everything she had achieved, everything she had become, for the sake of others. The comfortable life she had built in the palace, the security she enjoyed as queen, the favor she had cultivated with the king, all of it would have to be put on the line. As Esther contemplated Mordecai's words and wrestled with her decision, Haman continued to revel in what he believed was his complete victory. The decree had been issued, the machinery of destruction was in motion, and in less than a year, his hatred would be satisfied through the annihilation of an entire people. He had no idea that his carefully crafted plan was about to unravel in ways he never could have imagined. The irony of the situation was breathtaking. Haman, in his arrogance, had set in motion the very events that would expose his true character and lead to his ultimate downfall. By threatening Queen Esther's people, he had unknowingly declared war on the most powerful woman in the empire. By forcing Mordecai into desperate action, he had activated a network of relationships and loyalties that he didn't even know existed. But perhaps the greatest irony of all was that Haman's plot, designed to eliminate the Jewish people from history, would instead become the means by which their deliverance would be accomplished and their story would be preserved for all time. The very hatred that sought to destroy them would become the catalyst for their salvation, demonstrating once again that evil, no matter how clever or comprehensive, ultimately serves the purposes of justice and righteousness. And so we see how Haman's plot against Mordecai was ultimately exposed through the very pride that created it. One man's refusal to bow became the catalyst that revealed the depths of evil lurking in the Persian court, while also setting in motion the divine plan for deliverance. This timeless story reminds us that standing for truth, no matter the cost, can change the course of history itself.